My guest today is Professor Kevin Tracey, who's Professor of Molecular Medicine and Neurosurgery at Hofstra, Northwell. He is also the President and CEO of Feinstein Institutes for Medical Research. His latest book is Great Nerve. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you for having me on, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So, yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I know nothing about it. And so the great nerve. So you have multiple chapters here. So I got your book in front of me here. So the first part of it is the great secrets, understanding the hidden power of the vagus nerve. Um, and so before we get into details of this, Kevin, so could you sort of describe the vagus nerve a little bit? Where does it start? Where does it end? Where does it go? All of that stuff.
Sure. So the vagus nerve is the topic of tremendous interest right now. It has generated billions of web impressions and millions of social media posts. And there's a real fascination with the vagus nerve as a the hope and promise it brings for whether it's do-it-yourselfers at home or for very sophisticated advanced medical research. And so that's really the what the vagus nerve is today. It's a hot commodity, if you will. And what it is actually is it's a paired structure. You have two vagus nerves, like you have two thumbs and two kidneys, and it runs on each side of your neck. It originates in the brainstem at about the level of your ears, and it travels down across both sides of your neck and chest, and near the diaphragm, it intermingles right and left in a plexus before sending out branches that look almost like a jellyfish tentacles spreading throughout all the organs of your body. And what it does is it's a fundamental communication pathway between all the organs that you don't think about all day long and your brain. And the information is transmitted in 200,000 fibers in humans, about 100,000 on each side. So with all this chatter about the vagus nerve online and on social media, people say to me, I want to stimulate my vagus nerve. And I say, oh, really? Which one? You have 200, you have 200,000 fibers, and they all have specific anatomical roots, and they all have specific functions. And we're just now using very modern technology. My lab and hundreds of labs around the world are actually dissecting these fibers one at a time.
Yeah, so I was thinking, Kevin, I was reading through your book. I was thinking it's like I-95, but it's two I-95s in some sense, from Miami to Maine, as they say. Um, it's a long express highway. Is this an afterthought of evolution? Do we see the same thing in other mammals or primates or just humans?
Oh, it's a fundamental driving structure in all of evolution. There are primitive vagus nerve-like structures in C. elegans and
Mm,
in animals extending all the way up through the mammalian kingdom. The vagus nerve is characterized typically. It's thought of as a nerve that utilizes acetylcholine as its primary neurotransmitter,
mm,
and it travels from the brainstem through a very long preganglionic primary motor neuron, but then synapses on ganglia that send secondary nerves into the organs to mediate the direct function.
mm,
And another characteristic feature of the vagus nerve, and why I called my book The Great Nerve, is because that's what Galen called it.
mm,
Galen called it the Great Nerve because he realized that if it was cut on both sides, uh, that the animals, the pigs or sheep or whatever non-human primates he was working on would die. And to my knowledge, that's the only nerve in the body where if you cut it on both sides, you die. So it is a great nerve, and it
mm,
didn't get renamed the wandering or vagus nerve until 15 centuries later. And
mm,
frankly, I think the vagus nerve is much more interesting than a vagabond, and I think it's much more. The information it carries is much more important than the traffic on I-95. It's all actually highly organized and orchestrated, as the bedrock of individual reflex circuits that control the homeostasis of all your organs.
Mm. So I don't know if I understand this correctly, Kevin. So it starts, well, starting and ending could be, you know, changed differently, but starts in the brain and goes into the gut. And then it touches a lot of the organs by the peripheral effects. Not effects, I mean, they're actually touching the liver, touching the pancreas, and so on and so forth. And so this is fundamentally what's driving the driving the human in many ways, right? So we got onto it a little late in some ways because we have been symptomatically treating diseases for a long time. Um, but here is potentially a concept that is the architecture of the whole human body. So where are we in our understanding of the vagus nerve right now?
Well, I think there is a tendency, as you correctly point out, to approach it from top down, whether that's anthropomorphic or what. But in fact, it's much more informative when you consider the vagus nerve's role in biology and physiology, health and disease, to think of it, I think, from bottom up or from the body to the brain. And the reason is that 80% of those 200,000 fibers are sensory.
Mm,
So what does that mean? It means that the vagus nerve is uniquely wired to detect changes in the body's internal milieu. So if there's a change in your gut, as you said, this is detected by the vagus nerve, and the brain is informed. If there's a change in your kidneys, if there's a change in your liver or gallbladder or your pancreas,
mm,
these signals, whether they're metabolites, whether they are markers of inflammation or immune status, whether they are cellular markers, all of these have the potential to activate sensory fibers in the vagus nerve. And what happens is those fibers track up into the brainstem, and once there, the brain is uniquely wired, if you will, to respond through reflex circuits to maintain homeostasis.
mm,
So that that can occur as relatively simple reflex arcs, two or three synapses returning motor signals to correct uh, glucose homeostasis or other metabolic imbalances through these neural signals. But something else happens because these sensory inputs into the uh, brainstem from the vagus nerve signals from the organs are also relayed up higher into the higher brain structures where they can influence emotion
mm.
and mood and even thoughts. So so what you have is an important conducting system for information about the status of the body's organs and homeostasis, and hardwired reflexes that respond to changes in the environment to return the organs to homeostasis. So you're absolutely right. It's a fundamentally critical structure
Yeah.
that we're just now, 2,000 years after Galen,
Mm.
beginning to unravel with sufficient detail to understand each individual fiber.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Kevin. So whatever information is sent up to the brain, is the brain making some decisions and sending information back to the organs, or this is a one-way traffic?
I wouldn't use the word decision, but I would any more than you make a decision to have a knee-jerk reflex, right? The doctor taps your patellar tendon and your leg bounces up and you say, "Who did that?" It's not as if you decided.
Yeah.
But these are hardwired reflex circuits where an input elicits an output. Now
Mm,
the brain, of course, has 100 billion neurons and a trillion synapses. So once the input arrives into that structure, it can be processed and it can be manipulated, and you don't have to have always a singular input output response. It gets very complicated very quickly, of course.
mm, mm,
But but at the end of the day, it's very illustrative to study the functions of the vagus nerve and to understand our ability to utilize it for therapy by asking hardwired reflex questions. So for instance, in my laboratory at the Feinstein Institute,
Yeah.
we've spent the last 25, 30 years addressing the fundamental question of the role of vagus nerve signals traveling up and down in response to the presence of inflammation, and
Hmm.
understanding how the signals returning from the brain to the body are actually very important in turning off inflammation. And so,
Hmm.
by focusing on specific inputs, say a cytokine level like TNF, and specific outputs like the neural pathways, the action potentials and neurotransmitters that converge back on the body in response to the input, you can actually get tremendously important insights for developing new therapies, and that's what we've been doing.
Yeah, it's really interesting, Kevin. So you call it the reflex action. So I don't know if I'm understanding this correctly, Kevin. So reflex means to me that sort of programmatic reaction to something, and so in some sense, the CNS system we know has a lot of reflexes. I mean, not all the stuff need to go to the brain and get processed and sent back out. Yeah, is it in that sense?
I think it's important to break down when we talk about the brain, uh, the and reflexes, that we're talking primarily about the lower brain, the reptilian brain,
Mm.
the brain stem, where the incoming um, fibers from the vagus nerve and other visceral sensory inputs synapse on nuclei, such as the nucleus tractus solitarius and others. And
Mm.
those are like routers. But the first thing that can happen from those first synapses is you can have, through one or two more synapses, motor responses that return to the organ very, very quickly. Um, Programmed is sort of a loaded word in this AI era, as you know better than me. So I don't know if I would say that the reflexes are programmed. I would say they're hardwired.
Hard.
And
Yeah.
and that's what Ramon Cajal and Charles Sherrington taught us at the turn of the 20th century. So, their work on reflexes defined a couple of things. First, that nerves propagate inflammation that nerves propagate information in one direction. That was a critical
Mm.
insight from Ramon Cajal. And second, that reflexes operate in collaboration. This is another way to understand it. So we learned from Charles Sherrington that when you have a reflex activation of an extensor muscle group, for instance, that there is a corresponding inhibition
Yeah.
of the flexor muscle groups. And
Yeah.
so what you have now emerging from that, and there's that word emerging, right? You have behavior emerging.
Mm.
And so somewhere between the reptilian brain and going up to the midbrain and the emotional brain and finally to the cortex and the thinking brain, what emerges out of that
Mm.
starts with hardwired reflex circuits. And at the end of the day, you end up with Descartes' problem of mind body duality. And uh,
Right.
but but I would argue strongly that to understand physiology and homeostasis, a very important place to start is by understanding the individual reflex circuits that make up the inputs and outputs that govern physiology.
Mm. Yeah. So I started as an engineer, Kevin. When I realized I was a bad engineer, I had to get out of that. But I was in a large pharmaceutical company in the 90s, and I was asking scientists. It seems like we have a electromechanical chemical system. Um, we know that we can influence it through chemicals, but we should be able to influence it through electricity and magnetism. I mean, I knew nothing. I was totally an engineer, and they said, no, you're completely wrong. It has to be all chemicals because chemicals are easy. We can manufacture them. We can put into the body, and we know exactly what's going to happen. The exactly part I came to realize is not quite right over time. But so so did we miss a trick in this pharmaceutical business in some ways?
No, I don't think you missed a trick. I think that there is. there are business answers to your question and to your proposal, and there's scientific answers to your question and your proposal that you frame to your colleagues. And I break it down this way. So first of all, today we are developing devices, electronic devices. I started one company called SetPoint Medical in 2007, and that company recently announced a successful clinical trial last November of 242 patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Now, what's really important about these patients is that they were not getting better from the most powerful drugs that are available today, things like biologics, like anti-cytokines, methotrexate, and steroids, and these people were still suffering. So these were the sickest of the sick patients.
Yeah.
And the primary endpoint of the clinical trial was an ACR 20, a 20% improvement in American College of Rheumatology criteria system. And they hit the primary endpoint at 12 weeks. And it was a randomized blinded trial. You say, how did they blind the trial? Well, every patient was implanted with the device on day 0, and only half of them were turned on. So you have a sham surgery control. And what was so striking was after 12 weeks, first of all, they hit their primary endpoint. So if you're back at your big pharma, as you were once in the good old days, now
Yes.
you bet the farm. You hit the primary endpoint, you're going to bet the farm on that therapy. This wasn't a
Yeah.
drug, this was a device. But even beyond that, when they turned the device on now in the control group, which had the implant, but it was turned off at the beginning, what was so striking was two things. First, the original treatment group continued to improve. That usually does not happen after 12 weeks in a rheumatoid arthritis trial. You get an effect and that usually plateaus. Not in this case, they continue to improve. And second,
Mm.
the group that now was turned on at 12 weeks caught up to them at 24 weeks, which was
Mm.
striking. So right now, the FDA, as I understand it, I don't have inside information. I'm hoping, like others, that it just works out well. But the FDA is reviewing 18,000 pages of data from
Oh,
that
wow.
trial, and it may well lead to an approval. But why now and why not when you said it in the 1990s? Well, I think that's how long it takes to develop a convincing scientific mechanism story,
Yeah.
which we accomplished by using things like optogenetics. We used a laser beam on the dorsal motor nucleus of transgenic mice. We selectively stimulated the cholinergic fibers in the vagus nerve of the mouse. We followed the signals with neural recordings down into the abdomen. We identified synapses in the celiac superior mesenteric ganglion, which is the origin of the splenic nerve. We showed that flashing the laser in the brainstem
Mm.
activates corresponding compound action potentials flashing in the splenic nerve. And we showed that inside the spleen, norepinephrine from the splenic nerve activates a T cell subset that we discovered. These
Mm.
T cells express choline-acetyltransferase, which makes acetylcholine. It's the rate limiting enzyme in the biosynthesis of acetylcholine, and that the acetylcholine interacts with cytokine producing cells through a receptor called alpha 7, which shuts off cytokine release. So I
Mm.
can explain to you how the vagus nerve stimulator that we developed inhibits inflammation in those patients. And I think in many ways we have a better mechanistic understanding than we do for how anti-TNF works.
Mm. Yeah. So there are two important aspects here. One is homeostasis, which is the body has to keep everything in sort of in balance, so to speak. And the other is so we have this major nerve or nerve bundle, two of them, both sides, and it seems like it's a major aspect of how the body is sort of controlling itself. And then we have inflammation. So inflammation is quite interesting. Almost any disease that I can think of, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, anything, ultimately drives itself down to this problem. So I was thinking, Kevin, that I was reading through your book. 50,000 years ago in African savanna, we have been attacked by everybody, every microorganism, and the body developed a system to inflammate these things out of the body. And now in 2025, we don't have those things anymore. Well, I mean, we might have them in the future, but right now we don't have them. And so we have a over designed, let me call it that way, over designed system that appears to create a problem rather than a solution, right? So inflammation is a big problem, right? So the immune system, for instance, it's sort of over designed some ways. Is that the right way to think about it?
Perhaps I haven't thought of it that way. I would have argued that um, inflammation is inherently good for you. It's beneficial.
Hmm.
As you say, it helps to fight off. Inflammation occurs in two scenarios. First is infection, as you said, and the second is injury. In both of those scenarios, uh, the inflammation when it comes on is reacting to the damage or the infection. It's trying to restrain the invaders and repel them or kill them and heal the wound and stop the bleeding.
Hmm.
And this is the normal function of inflammation. I think what happens in the modern era is not that inflammation is the problem. It may well be that the failure to control inflammation is the problem. So
Hmm.
inflammation is controlled by mechanisms that accelerate its resolution called resolvins, and this is brilliant work led by Charlie Sirhan and other labs around the world. Um, the second way inflammation is controlled is it's shut off by two major pathways. The first would be the hormonal pathway. So these are molecules like glucocorticoid hormones and what are called anti-inflammatory cytokines and other molecules that literally damp down the activity of inflammatory cells. And the second major pathway that dampens inflammation, as my colleagues and I discovered, are signals in nerves, in nerve fibers.
Hmm.
And these nerve signals are different from the hormonal signals because the nerve signals can act very, very quickly.
Yes.
They can act locally and they can act short term, whereas the hormonal or circulating factors tend to accumulate over longer periods of time and diffuse everywhere. So putting it all together, I agree with you. Today, the major threat to the human species is not infectious disease.
Hmm.
The major killers on the planet Earth every year are all diseases that are caused by inflammation or made worse by it, ranging from heart disease and stroke to cancer to neurodegeneration to
Hmm.
metabolic syndrome, obesity, diabetes, hypertension. And these are, according to the WHO, these conditions account for 40 million deaths of the 60 million people that die every year.
Hmm.
So we've solved infectious diseases. I say that somewhat euphemistically and provocatively. It is not, I mean, infectious diseases in the late 1900s, I'm sorry, in the late 1800s, infectious diseases were responsible for 70% of the deaths in Boston, Massachusetts.
Hmm.
And that's not the case anymore. So
Yeah.
so what is the case? The case is inflammation. And the question looms large. If we controlled inflammation in the next 10 or 20 years, like
Hmm.
we controlled infection in the last 100 years,
Hmm.
what would happen? I think we would enjoy, all of us, a longer health span. And I
Hmm.
think understanding inflammation and how it's regulated by the nervous system and vagus nerve is one of the most interesting areas in all of science right now.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, it's irony in some sense, Kevin. So, finely tuned Homo sapien body can fight off any infection. Um, and now we don't have many infections. And so now we have an overtuned, so to speak, system. And we got inflammation all over the body. Even if, you're not falling down, Homo sapiens were falling down from the trees, they were getting hit by animals. None of those things are happening. So there is no localized injury that,
But I think we're doing other things to our bodies now
yeah.
that have replaced infection as the drivers to inflammation. So, I think our diets now are have the capacity, high glucose, high sugar, high fat diets have the capacity to endogenously accelerate the amount of inflammation. A sedentary lifestyle will if not stimulate inflammation, certainly enhance it if something else starts it. And so I think you're right. The threats are different, but in modern society, the widespread availability of food and the other lifestyle changes do serve as chronic sources of inflammation.
So inflammation is fundamental. I remember reading a paper, Kevin, so some time ago that one could characterize Alzheimer's as an inflammation of the brain. And we know type 2 diabetes and other things, the metabolic syndrome, as they call it, is an inflammatory disease. And so we have basically now inflammation killing us. At the end of the day, it's inflammation that's killing humans. And all the diseases that you can think of, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, that's half of our healthcare budget right now, cancer and other things. So it all points down to a singular issue in the body. Would you agree with that?
I would agree that inflammation is an important target for all those conditions. It's not, of course, the sole cause of all those conditions, but in all those conditions, the presence of inflammation can, in some cases, cause the problem, and in nearly all cases, in most cases, it makes the problem worse. It's a feature of many of those conditions. So I think it's important, I think, to stop for a minute and
Yeah.
talk about definitions and semantics, because I
Yeah.
think, you started with the reference to Alzheimer's disease, and as recently as 20 years ago, there was significant controversy as to whether the presence of inflammatory cells in Alzheimer's tissue or brains was actually injurious or protective. And there is still some debate going on about the protective versus damaging effects of inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. Although I think most in the field would agree with the consensus that inflammation is a contributing factor on the harmful side in Alzheimer's. But at this point, it warrants, I think, a word of caution. Not in the interpretation, but in what it means. So the word inflammation, again, it dates back to the ancient Romans and Greeks, who talked about redness and swelling and pain and heat. And
Yeah.
that's still what we teach
Yes.
in medical school. That's still what the inflammation is defined by the cardinal signs, and then later the addition of loss of function. So fine, that makes sense when you have a sprained ankle, or perhaps even when you have an abscess, an infected abscess in your neck. But does it really make sense to apply, to call inflammation? What is inflammation in an Alzheimer's brain? Well, there's no redness. There's no heat. There may or may not be any swelling. But what it means in that case is that we look under the microscope and we look at the collection of immune cells in the brain tissue, and they reflect more of a condition of inflammation than of non-inflammation. So, and that you can do the same thing with heart attack, right? So you have an obstructed coronary artery because you have an acute clot that's formed on top of foam cells that are a type of fat accumulating macrophage. And so here you have the inflammatory cells at the bottom causing the whole thing, perhaps. And there's good evidence for the fact that increasing inflammation increases the risks of myocardial ischemia and stroke through these kinds of mechanisms. I'm not trying to weigh in on these mechanisms as some expert. I'm just pointing out that when you look at those coronary arteries, it's not the cardinal signs of inflammation that we use in that word. I'm making an argument that, we may be limiting ourselves by semantics. There's been several attempts to deal with this. There's a word called inflammaging, which links the complications of tissue injury to the presence of excessive inflammation that progresses with age. There's words of there's other monikers of inflammation that have been applied to metabolic syndrome, and there's a word focusing on the metabolism of immune cells in various states of inflammation, immunometabolic. So there's a need, I think, to as scientists and physician scientists, we can dive through this and think through it and explain it. But when these words are thrown around on social media or on the web, I think they have the great capacity or the great potential to cause confusion.
Cause confusion. Yeah. So one thing I wasn't really aware of at all, Kevin. So we want to talk a little bit about depression, and I wasn't. So you have a chapter here, beyond medication and healing reflex for depression. Um, I wasn't at all aware of depression being sort of a inflammatory. Well, and call it an inflammatory disease, but it has a correlation to inflammation, right? Depression.
So, as of today, the most recent consensus statements on depression indicate that the serotonin hypothesis, which is based on the ability for some serotonin-based pharmacology to actually improve some patients with depression and anxiety disorder. There's no evidence of cause and effect for serotonin in
Mm.
depression. And this has created some important questions. It doesn't mean that these drugs should not be marketed. It doesn't mean that everybody's wrong. It means that if you prescribe an SSRI, for instance, to patients with depression, some percentage of them may gain some clinical benefit, and that's great. It doesn't mean that we understand how serotonin participates in the pathogenesis of depression. So, in fact, there's some evidence that SSRIs may actually be changing serotonin levels, not the other way around, not that the depression is changing the serotonin levels. So,
Mm.
but suffice it to say, and that there's controversy on the role of serotonin in depression. So, what the argument I lay out in my book um, is to dive into that a little bit and say, well, what else could it be? Now, I don't propose to have the answers, but I'm very intrigued by the fact that cytokines do fulfill Koch's postulates, modified Koch's postulates, if you will,
Mm.
as necessary and sufficient mediators of depression, anxiety-like conditions in animals and humans. So,
Yeah.
for instance, if I infuse you with a cytokine like TNF or some of the interferons, you will develop features of sickness syndrome, social withdrawal, loss of interest in your hobbies and potentially your friends. You may feel sad. You will exhibit signs and symptoms that are very much
Mm.
like depression. And we know this
Yeah.
because I've done it in clinical research projects with healthy volunteers. And every day, somewhere in the world, patients are infused with cytokines like this to treat various conditions,
Mm.
including cancer. And so we know this is true. And we also know in patients with depression, large clinical studies, that there is widespread evidence documented in very carefully done studies around the world. There's evidence of biomarkers of increased inflammation in the bodies of these patients.
Mm.
Now, does that prove that inflammation causes depression in all patients? Of course not. But my argument in the book is that it may be that some patients with depression
Yeah.
have their primary um, etiology or driver of their depression originating from inflammation in their bodies, and it's the excessive inflammation that's inducing the responses in their brain that lead to the depression. Now, those patients might be candidates for being treated with vagus nerve stimulators or other therapies. This has not it hasn't been possible as of now to identify these patients. We don't have the right tests and biomarkers to
Yeah.
identify the inflammatory burden in these patients, if you will, in a way that's sensitive enough and specific enough to recommend a therapy. But it's certainly, as a scientist, a physician scientist, it's a fascinating research question. I wish more people were working on it. That was the plea in my book, to try to encourage more people to study these questions.
Yeah. I remember like 20 years ago, Kevin, reading something that said most of the diseases are plumbing problems. We just cannot get rid of stuff that we don't need anymore in the body. It's not, the tubes are not big enough to flush out these things. Is there something to that in this context?
I'm not sure. I'm much more
Yeah.
intrigued by the fact that the body functions in a complex balancing act between multiple systems. And these systems are, I think of them as violin strings. And each system is a separate instrument in a string orchestra. So you got the cello section and the violins and the basses. And when these instruments are all playing in harmony, they
Mm,
are the different strings are being plucked on the different instruments, but it sounds like a beautiful symphony. And
mm,
that orchestration occurs through the nervous system. And I
yeah.
think the more we learn about homeostasis and what's the opposite of homeostasis, right? Disease. And the more
Yes.
we learn about the failures of homeostasis that contribute to disease, the more we're learning that the nervous system plays a critical role at every juncture. And
Mm,
to the extent that we can identify the inputs and outputs and understand how to initiate corrective action,
mm,
I think that's a real opportunity that we have actually today. I mean, if you look in the ICU, if you walk
yeah.
through the ICU, um, what you see are that the patients um, oscillating networks between, say, their heart and their lungs and their kidneys and their EEGs. Everything is marching in lockstep,
Mm,
and that means that's how you know someone's really sick. When
yeah.
when when they're exhibiting almost like nodal behavior between these complex networks, they're
Yeah.
all spiking at the same time. Whereas you walk in, if you were to do those measures on in a gymnasium full of healthy people,
Mm,
you would find that their networks are all they're oscillating with high variability.
mm,
So the heart, so you see individual time domain between individual heartbeats
mm,
is highly variable. That's called high heart rate variability. Everybody wants that on their Apple Watch or whatever
yeah.
Fitbit
Yeah.
they're using. And that same concept applies to all of the organs. And the nervous system is front and center in coordinating. It's the maestro coordinating these things. And I think that's the opportunity not only to learn more, but also to develop more therapies.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to sort of finish up with on a lighter stuff here on your chapter 3 here, Kevin. So um, I would say this is not necessarily science, but it's interesting information. So great expectations, you say, everyday tools with promise, meditation and breath work. So what have you found here? So these are sort of different ways. Oh, before we get into it, I just want to talk about your device. So we know the vagus nerve is a major highway, two of them, in the body, and it appears that it is sort of important information in the body, right? Is that what we find?
Yes, the vagus nerve signals in those 200,000 fibers, we estimate that perhaps 1 or 2,000 of those fibers are like the brakes in your car. They send tonic inhibitory signals to the amount of inflammation being produced by your innate immune system. So, for instance, in animal experiments in mice, if we cut the vagus nerves to the innate immune system, what we find, and then stimulate the innate immune system, we find that there's a significantly accelerated or a heightened response. So
Mm.
that means that the vagus nerve is tonically inhibiting the amount of inflammation that your body produces. And that's very, very important. And we see this in clinical studies. So in clinical studies of families of autoimmune disease, we and others have seen in the literature that patients subjects at risk for developing autoimmune disease tend to have lower heart rate variability before the onset of their disease. So
Mm.
it's as if the failure of the brakes may, and this isn't completely proved yet, but the failure of the brakes and the failure of the vagus nerve inhibition on innate immunity may contribute to the disease in some patients.
Yeah, so I just want to sort of finish up with your ideas here. So meditation, breath work. Um, so I think you're arguing here. I didn't read the whole book, Kevin, so I'm speculating here. You're arguing here is that without a stimulator on the vagus nerve, which could be sort of an artificial device you can put on the vagus nerve for a variety of reasons, reducing inflammation and other things, but you could actually do it through other ways. And you say here meditation and breath work. Do we have any evidence for these things working?
Yeah, no, my argument is that the evidence is weak. We have associative evidence, correlative evidence in some studies of subjects doing various types of breath work that is associated with decreasing biomarkers of inflammation. But most of these studies are small. It's
Yeah,
extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult to control these studies
yeah.
because of various types of practice that people use. My point in that chapter is to be careful what you believe from what is being recommended, right?
Mm.
So I think it's safe to say that breath work and relaxation techniques generally make a lot of people feel better.
Mm.
Uh, and in general, they are associated with a healthy lifestyle, perhaps by reducing anxiety, maybe by reducing inflammation in some people.
Yeah,
Some
the
people
question,
some
sorry.
people some people during their breath work reduce their heart rate, and in
Yeah.
those cases, it's possible they're stimulating branches of their vagus nerve that go
Yeah.
to their heart. But what I don't agree with is the widespread uh, use of the term meditation stimulates my vagus nerve. I say maybe. I
Okay.
say maybe. Maybe it does. But which one? You have 200,000. And there we just don't know. We don't know.
Yeah, so what I was wondering, Kevin, is that let's say there's an effect. Is the effect tactical, or is the effect, sort of long term? If it's tactical, I mean, there are a lot of things that we can find, that sort of helps you for 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, and goes away. I mean, it's useful, I guess, in some sense, but that's not a therapy in some ways. So I'm wondering whether we have any data on sort of the longitudinal effect or the long-term effect of these procedures. Yeah.
Not on meditation and breath work, but we do have lots of data on 1 minute stimulation of the vagus nerve on what that does to cytokine responses.
Yeah.
And the half-life from a 1 minute stimulation, the biologic half-life for suppressing inflammation is somewhere between 6 and 12 hours.
Hmm.
So in the clinical trial I mentioned before, done by SetPoint Medical, the device was only activated for 1 minute a day at about 4:30 in the morning. Many of the patients slept through it and didn't know they were having any therapy.
Okay.
But what we've shown in the lab is that this single 1 minute pulse gives a massive amplification of the signal, and at every step from the celiac ganglion to the chat T cells in the spleen, and onward, you see an amplification of the signal. And so at the end of the line, the acetylcholine is pushing M1 pro-inflammatory monocytes into tissue reparative M2 monocytes. And once
Mm,
that occurs, those cells don't go back. So
mm,
what you have from a very short stimulus um, is a long-term biologic effect that persists, which is why it works in these clinical trials for 1 minute a day. Now, can you apply that? Can you apply that to breathing exercises, cold plunges, or other quote unquote vagus nerve stimulation modalities that you read about online? I don't know. I mean, the
mm.
question really is, are the breathing exercise stimulating the same fibers that we stimulated when we used a device?
Yeah.
It's certainly a different method, and it may or may not have anything. They may be two totally unrelated things. If you
Mm,
want to stimulate your vagus nerve, there's two ways to do it specifically. One is to have an implant placed on the
yeah.
vagus nerve in your neck, and the second is to use focus ultrasound, which can stimulate the nerve through the skin without surgery, but that's not available yet for widespread use.
So on the neck, that's an invasive procedure. Is it sort of a 1 day procedure
Yes, it's
or?
a same day surgery, and in the morning, home in the afternoon. It's very safe. You know, the experience from vagus nerve stimulation actually dates back for decades.
Mm,
There's at least 250,000 people have had the vagus nerve stimulation surgery, a similar type of surgery for epilepsy and depression therapy, and the risks are very well known. There's always a
mm,
risk of wound infection or nerve injury, but these risks are very, very small in large
yeah.
populations. And I'm sorry, when you look at the severity of these rheumatoid arthritis patients who are taking drugs that cost $100,000 a year, they have black box warnings, which means you
Mm,
can get cancer or lethal infection from as a side effect and many other side effects. And you compare that to the side effects or adverse events, even in the recent clinical trial for vagus nerve stimulation and rheumatoid arthritis,
mm,
it's a highly favorable balance.
yeah. So I want to finish up with something practical here. So the last part of your book, your great nerve, how to talk to your doctor. And you say here the clear and present future, computer chips, not medicines. I like that, Kevin, quite a bit. I mean, I believed this for 30 years. I just didn't have any evidence for it. So now we sort of know the mechanism, it seems to me. We sort of know how to influence that mechanism. And rather than putting hormones and chemicals into the body that goes all around the place that we know, we don't really know what's going to happen there. This is very targeted, very specific. And I'm wondering, Kevin, is there an app for it? You know, can I actually dial up or dial down my stimulation in some ways?
So the way it will work is patients will receive the implant from probably a neurosurgeon and then continue to be treated by their rheumatologist, uh, assuming that, hoping the FDA approves this. This is what probably most likely happen. And the rheumatologist, yes, will adjust the frequency and the strength of the signal. The device is about the size of a fish oil pill, and it's implanted in the neck, but it communicates to the doctor's tablet, and the tablet will be used to adjust the therapy. And by the desire of the physicians and the patients, these meetings will probably happen once every 6 weeks or so. So
Mm,
as the disease changes, gets better hopefully, or doesn't, the device can be adjusted up and down. So that is what's happening. And it's really important that we say it. You and I both know this. There will be patients that don't benefit from this. This is not
yeah.
going to help all patients, but it is a clear and present future because I've already met patients, and I tell the stories of some of them in this book. I've already met patients who are in remission, if not cured, taking no medications other than their vagus nerve stimulator implanted in their neck. And
Mm,
so, and these are people, some of them who were nearly disabled prior to the vagus nerve stimulator. So these are wonderful stories, and they give me tremendous hope. However, it's clear, and that's happening in the present, but it's clear that these devices, like any other therapy, they're not going to help 100% of people. So what does that
Yeah.
mean? It means it's time to double down on our research and learn even more because, if we're stimulating 1,000 fibers or maybe 2,000 in the vagus nerve with our current therapies,
Mm.
what about the other 198,000 fibers? What can we do there? And what about the other nerves that go to the body's other organs that are not the vagus nerve, branches of the sympathetic nervous system and branches
Mm.
of the sensory nervous system that have all been implicated in having effects on the immune system. So, as I said before, this field of neuroimmunology and bioelectronic
Yeah.
medicine, I think, is the fastest growing, most interesting field in all of science. And it's because we're right around the corner from being able to help so many millions of people.
Yeah, so I feel sort of vindicated, Kevin. This is the human body is an electromechanical chemical system. We have found easy ways to influence it through chemicals, but we have two other things that we could use: electricity and magnetism. And I don't know when we're going to get to the latter part of it, but electricity appears to be a lot easier for us to understand. It's sort of related in some ways. Um, Chemicals, once you sort of put it into the body, we have no clue what it's going to do. Over time, we found so many side effects on all the chemical medications that people are taking. It is an uncontrolled process in the biological system, whereas electromagnetic processes could be more targeted, could be more controllable, could be more programmable in some ways. And so I'm very optimistic about this, Kevin. So yeah, so what are your closing thoughts on this?
Well, I think you make some really important points. Drugs have made the world a better place for millions of people, and there's no doubt for their importance, and they're not going to go away. However, they don't work in everybody, and they have side effects. And I think that we have now seen some patients who have benefited significantly from a targeted bioelectronic therapy stimulating their vagus nerve to turn off their inflammation. We've seen this in
Mm.
we've seen this in rheumatoid arthritis. We've seen this in Crohn's disease. We've seen this in ulcerative colitis. And there's now some recent work from Yakov Levine at SetPoint and colleagues in my lab looking at animal models of multiple sclerosis, where there's evidence that these modalities can accelerate
Mm.
remyelination. So not only stop the demyelination, but accelerate the remyelination. So I think you're going to see forthcoming clinical trials in multiple sclerosis. I suspect that in many ways, the we're at a new beginning
Yeah.
where many more clinical trials will be performed. So even back to the basics like depression, there was recently a very large clinical trial that completed in vagus nerve stimulation and depression, and it had mixed results. There were clearly some people who were significantly better, but it
Yeah.
was a very large population study, and it's going to be difficult to make, based on the results, make broad recommendations across the whole population. However, my question is, how can we identify the people that benefited? I mean, there are patients in some of these cohorts who were suicidal and are no
Mm.
longer suicidal. And so, how can we construct clinical trials
Mm.
to have a risk benefit ratio where we select populations of patients
Mm.
for bioelectronic interventions based on mechanisms that we continue to discover and will be discovering? I think it's a really exciting future, and I think you're going to see a tremendous amount of activity in this area.
Yes, I would love to work with you on that, Kevin. So the risk benefit ratio, the aggregate statistics, is not the way to think about um, information, I would argue, right? Um, and so if, I don't know, 5% of the population benefit infinitely, um, that is a lot more value in the grand scheme of things, right? So as long as the downside risk of that people dying by taking a medication or something. Um, so we have to think about how we are thinking about pharmaceuticals, benefit and cost more systematically. I don't know if FDA really thinks that way. I'm not sure. But yes, so I'll give you the last comment here, and then we'll finish up.
Well, I think that there are a lot of biostatisticians interested in addressing clinical trial design and how we make these decisions. But it's going to be they're working against a steady headwind. There is a lot of dogma and a lot of important um, need for randomized, large cohort, clinical, carefully controlled blinded clinical trials to guide medical decision making. That's not going to go away. So
Mm,
I agree with you. We need to do the work and understand, and like they have done in cancer, I would argue,
yeah.
where you treat each individual cancer patient as a unique entity with a unique tumor genome and a unique patient genome and a unique medical history, and you put that together as best you can.
Mm,
Um, guided, globally by large randomized clinical trials, but specific decision making is individualized. That's where we need to get to someday. And I think, Gil, I think you're right. I think that technologies like bioelectronic therapy stimulating the vagus nerve is a way to get more quickly to individualized decision making for patients who are not responding to expensive, uh, powerful anti-inflammatory drugs. I think it's a new era for that.
yeah. So we're running out of time, Kevin. So I just wanted to ask you one last question. So this device, does it have to be inside the body, or can we actually influence the vagus nerve from outside some ways?
In order to stimulate the vagus nerve and know that you're stimulating the vagus nerve, it requires a surgically implanted device. That
Okay.
being said, there are many, many companies, too many to count, selling devices that are labeled or that they call vagus nerve stimulators that are basically TENS units, transcutaneous electrical nerve stimulators. And
Mm,
these have been around for many decades and can be bought over the counter in many cases.
mm.
The idea is by driving electricity through the skin that you may lead to some activation of the vagus nerve to get the beneficial effects on inflammation or depression or epilepsy or other conditions. But what the but whether those devices have an effect or not is usually determined in clinical trials, and some of the clinical trial results are quite promising. The FDA has approved these transcutaneous devices for conditions like migraine headache
Yeah.
and and for reducing the symptoms of opioid withdrawal. And so that's good. There's clinical evidence that these things have some effect, but
Mm.
there's almost no evidence that these TENS units are electrically stimulating the vagus nerve. So that's what they're called, but whether they're actually doing that from an engineering perspective is quite unlikely.
Yeah, so I'm just thinking, migraine and things like that. It could be huge placebo effect as well. I might just start to believe that it's working. Maybe, I'm just making a statement. Yeah.
Well, maybe. I think some of the clinical trials have been pretty well done, and they would
Yeah.
argue against a placebo effect. But it's possible that when you drive electricity into the skin, that
Mm.
that activates sensory nerves that transmit information into the central nervous system and brain. And
Yeah.
once those neural signals are processed by the brain, it's very, very difficult to point to some effect as a mechanism because the brain's a complicated place.
Brain is a complicated place. So we will stop there, Kevin. It's excellent. Yeah. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed speaking with you, Gil.
Thank you.